Let us pray. Mighty God, may your word transform our minds so that we may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect in your sight. Speak, O Lord, for your servants listen. Amen. The book of Exodus is one of the greatest stories ever told. Even the least biblically literate amongst us is familiar with the story of Moses and how he led the Israelites, God's chosen people, out of slavery and into the promised land. Epic movies, African-American spirituals, children's books, famous speeches have been inspired by this movement from slavery to freedom. The book of Exodus gives us a parting of the Red Sea, the 10 plagues, manna from heaven, and the 10 commandments. In fact, just last month when we were in Denmark meeting our new grandson, little Bobby was put to sleep, not in what we call a bassinet, but amusingly, the Moses basket. We call this first episode of Exodus Resistance in the Reeds. The children of Israel are in Egypt because generations before, during a famine, they migrated south looking for food, and as ancestors of Joseph and his brothers, the Egyptians welcomed them. They settled in and thrived, generation after generation, until the new Pharaoh, with no evidence, started to perceive them as a security threat to the state. Attempting an oh-so-familiar strategy throughout history for new leaders, whether an Egyptian Pharaoh or a Nazi Hitler, or candidates for prime ministers or presidents, to solidify power by singling out a relatively weak minority or outsider group and calling them an enemy. The Pharaoh's first act of oppression was to turn the Hebrews into forced laborers, slaves, to build cities for the royal family. Yet as God's chosen people, these trials only made them stronger, and they continued to multiply. And so the dumbfounded Pharaoh ramped up his intolerance for the Hebrews by summoning Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives in charge of birthing Hebrew babies. He tells them to kill all the Hebrew boys at time of birth. Now, the fact that we know these midwives' names is a less than subtle use of irony, as the Pharaoh's daughter remains nameless. This serves to elevate their position in the story, and so we should not be surprised when they disobey the king's orders, fearing God, not the king. Two strong, brave, faithful, remarkable women on the edge of history listen to the voice of God. Engage in the Bible's first recorded act of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance, and ignore what a man tells them to do. And so the babies keep coming. You know that story, really? Never happens to you, right? And so the babies keep coming. And when the Pharaoh summons and questions them, they lie and get away with it. These Hebrew mothers are strong. They have their babies before we can get there. Sorry about that. Wink, wink. In the process, Shiphrah and Puah protect the birth of one special child named Moses. Well, the Hebrews continue to multiply, and so the king steps up his game again by commanding every Hebrew boy to be pitched into the Nile. Pharaoh allows Hebrew girls to live. In his arrogance, he wrongly sees them as no threat. Moses' mother, the third heroine of the story, in an act of desperation, takes a bunch of papyrus, does what she can to make it waterproof, and places it amongst the reeds on the banks of the Nile River. Can you imagine putting your baby in a basket on a river? It's both an act of great faith, yet heartbreakingly limited. We see these women doing the same thing today, sending their kids across deserts of Mexico and on boats to escape civil wars. Survival in the climate elements, 1, maybe 2 days at the most. With that, the mother leaves the scene, and the sister takes over from there. She does what big sisters do. They watch. They listen. They report back. Enter Pharaoh's daughter. She had a different agenda from the other girl in the reeds. Go to the river, take a bath, and come home. So here we have 2 girls in the reeds. They know what they are supposed to do. They know the law. Hide and watch, bathe and dress. Do as you're told and come home. And they might have done it, might not even have met one another, but the reeds are a watery, slippery, in-between kind of place, muddy and murky and hard to find your footing. And then the Egyptian princess finds the Hebrew baby. You know what she was supposed to do, so did she, to the sister, but she was surprised. She was supposed to tip over the basket and let that baby tumble into the water. At the very least, close the lid, give the basket a push, and send it on down the river for someone else to deal with it. The princess is our last heroine. She names what she sees. A Hebrew baby, easily identified because no other mother would be reduced to putting their babies in baskets to float down the Nile. Her words, overheard by the other girl in the reeds, invites this older sister to speak up. And just like that, they make a crazy plan so Moses' mom can raise her own child in the palace, get paid for it, so the child lives right down the hallway from the man who wanted him dead. The ironies of the story signal the fracturing of Pharaoh's power and worldview. This ancient text from Exodus echoes powerfully in our congregation's nation and world. Issues of race and politics, religion and politics, gender and power, the war on terror, debates over immigration policy, the inequities of the global economy, congregational mission and hospitality to the stranger, and all manner of suffering and bondage that threaten the individuals and families to whom we minister. Not so very long ago, in the civil rights movements of the 60s, and I'm old enough to remember that, American men and women, black and white, normally conventional law-abiding citizens deliberately broke laws, their conscience, their moral compass told them were unfair, unjust, and wrong. They sat at segregated lunch counters, deliberately disobeyed racist laws, picketed, protested, marched. Some ended up in jail. Others were tear gassed, beaten. A few were killed. I thought that battle had been waged and run, and now it seems we're fighting it all over again. the same protests, and the same tear gas. So now I'm wondering about me and you and what we are going to do when we find ourselves in the weeds during one of the most surreal years this country has ever had. I have millennial children, and I tell them, indeed, this is the most surreal year this country has ever had. Why does racism and bigotry have such a grip on us? And how on earth are we ever going to hear each other talk without shutting each other down? These resistors speak to us from the weeds, offering us some guidance. First, act on your compassion. What are you going to do about the baby in the basket, the Syrian refugee, the addict, the worker when the factory shuts down, or the Honduran child with no place to go? What are you going to do about access to health care, equal education, and affordable housing in our own backyards? What are you going to do about violent crime and the way too many guns in the wrong hands? What are you going to do when you walk into a ballot box the next time, knowing the profound consequence of how government can act equally for or against the common good? Each one of the women in our story had a choice to act legally or to act ethically. They chose life instead of death. What choices are we making? Second, fear the consequence of inaction. As I was writing this sermon, a CNN article popped up on my cell phone entitled, "White Supremacists by Default: How Ordinary People Made Charlottesville Possible." The writer cuts to the core and warns against passivity, both on a personal level and national one. His words, "If you don't speak up when intolerance is being promoted, you end up being complicit in the actions taken by its more extreme adherents. Once the demons are unleashed, you have become a co-conspirator." We hear moral equivalent statements like, "yes, but," to equate the actions of the oppressors with the protests of the oppressed. How often do we use the same moral equivalents in our own speech? Third, see the humanity in the stranger. We self-segregate by where we live, where we go to school with, and whom we spend our time with. Statistics show that people with the least amount of interaction with people who are not like them in color, race, or creed are the most bigoted and the most afraid. The midwives and the Pharaoh's daughter made ethical choices because when they gazed upon a baby, they didn't see an enemy, but a helpless child. And lastly, when you are down in the weeds, these women would tell us to start by telling the truth about what you do see, because one truth calls forth another. And you never know who may be listening and waiting for a reason to stand with you and make a plan to save a life. This is how God's liberating work starts, with an interruption we didn't expect and a body we have to acknowledge. Just ask all the people in this church who have learned how to house a refugee in 24 hours or less. This story tells us that we you and I, as followers of Jesus, must be instruments of God's will, God's justice and truth. Listen to your conscience, God's voice in your hearts, and act on it with compassion and with courage. God's liberation of a people can start with a couple of girls and one crazy idea. And I know a few of you crazy girls and guys are out there. That Moses can grow up and the exodus out of slavery can begin again. Praise be to God.